So having looked at how gypsies wanted to escape and become princesses, I thought, well, let's have a look at other forms of escapism and perhaps other ideals that they're chasing, if it's not princesses. And I thought to have a look at the imagery of fairies, paying particular attention to Cicely Mary Barker's Flower Fairies of Spring, which is a book that my mum had when she was a child, this one, and one that I remember being read when I was a child. And I think the imagery in these books is almost kind of a precursor to the Disney Princess, which came sort of quite soon after this was published in 1923. Then you sort of start to see the Disney Princess come out. I guess the first one would be Snow White in the 1930s. So you can see how this ideology is changing in the minds of young children, and how that's being instilled from a young age. So looking at the imagery, I sort of saw how here again there's lots of kind of layers of sheer fabric, and a lot of the pictures are of kind of fine layers of fabric sort of blowing in the wind and things like that, which moved me on to looking at the Pre-Raphaelites, and especially Gabriele Rossetti and some of his paintings, where you might have a woman or a fairy queen lying in the woods, a damsel in distress, and she's got kind of all these layers of fabric kind of billowing around her. And I thought this kind of took me back to the idea of my sister's prom dress, and how that kind of fabric felt. And I thought, you know, let's in order to embody this idea of escapism and fairy tale, let's try and replicate some of the silhouettes and some of the garments that are depicted in these fairy tales. So I moved on to having a look at the movement of fabric, which I think, if ever a time that were to be very important, it's in bridal wear. And I decided what I wanted was, as these garments went down the catwalk, whichever ones were to have skirts, let's say, I want them to look as if they're gliding. I want the fabric to move in its own way and do the work for me. So what I have to do is kind of create the skirt and put it on the wearer, and then all the impact's created just by it moving, rather than putting it in a structural sense. So I sort of started Googling pictures of fabric and being whirled around and swirled in the air, and trying to find out kind of exactly what look I wanted to go for. And I think, having had a look at all of them, what I wanted was something slightly heavier with the fabric. So at that stage I just started experimenting with different layers of fabric to see which worked best. And I think in the end what was the best outcome was to have 2 layers of heavily gathered sheer fabric with an underskirt of gathered fine satin. Because what this did is, it was heavy enough to give kind of impact, because if it was too light it kind of lost that grandeur, and risked looking a bit cheap or see-through. But it wasn't so heavy that the movement of the fabric was restricted by too many layers. So this, I think, worked best, and we carried that through right to the catwalk show. Up to this stage, I'd looked at a very kind of female domain, with the fairies, the princesses, and the movement of fabric. These were all kind of very feminine aspects, and I thought, well, I need to have balance, if anything, and this can't just be men in dresses. I don't want them to be transvestites. I want it to be believable male apparel. And even if the collection were to be worn by women, which we agreed would be absolutely fine, we always needed it to come from a point where it had been inspired by men's wear and what men would want to wear. So at this stage, we both kind of discussed how we could add masculinity back in. So I actually tried on my sister's prom dress, but I kind of folded the bodice underneath, so I just had this long skirt. And then we started adding in different things, like a men's dress shirt and a kind of a long blazer and a top hat, to kind of see what we could do to bring in more masculine cuts. And I think what came out was that, the top hat stayed right to the collection, and we also decided that we needed to emphasise the shoulders, because that's an area of strength in men, and kind of brings back the idea of men being upside down triangles. So we broadened the shoulders by adding kind of puffed sleeves and things like that. But I think there was kind of more to be gained after this stage, so I thought I'm going to carry on looking at ways to add strength and a masculine element to the design work. So going back to what I'd said at the beginning about this collection being androgynous, I kind of started trying to dive into what aspects of androgyny and strength I could find. And one thing I came across which became very inspirational was to look at elves, especially as depicted in Lord of the Rings. So, and I think what was really inspiring about looking at them is that both the men and the women looked similar to each other, and yet they also both looked very strong. And I think this really came from kind of a readiness for war. And I think this kind of was applicable to the project in itself, in that we were fighting a battle with this project, a battle for what we believed to be right. And I remember seeing the director's commentary, and Peter Jackson was saying how Tolkien had seen and fought in World War One and seen it as a futile war, and a war that didn't need to be fought, and a complete waste of time, money and lives and resources and land. But then also was writing the books in the time of World War Two, which was a very important war to fight, obviously to overthrow Hitler. And I think that's what I saw from this collection, was it was a war worth fighting. And so that's why I tried to kind of draw in elements of strength from looking at elves. So I didn't want to kind of copy the shapes exactly, so I started looking at the places they lived in and the spaces they moved in, looking at Lothlorien and Rivendell and the cities, and trying to imagine what garments I would see moving around places like this, looking at the beds they sleep in and imagining them as sort of the matrimonial bed. And I think what came out was kind of how you could combine beautiful flowing layers with kind of armour and the clothes of war, and how I needed some more structured fabrics in there, as well as kind of the softer sheer fabrics, really to give it strength, but also how a lot of it came from posture. So how the clothes that I created needed to change the posture of the wearer to ready them for the battle we're going to fight. And I think this came from looking at kind of higher fronted tops, you know, having a collar which makes the head stay straight, and having elements which make the shoulders remain horizontal and proud. So that's the silhouette had to be one of masculinity and strength, because that's what was present in both the men and the women, but also that it had to be one of kind of softness and femininity at the same time. So I think what I learned from looking at the elves was that I had to strike a balance between what's masculine and what's feminine in order to achieve something that's believably and kind of plausibly androgynous.